I want to pass the baton off to Don, who is going to focus on one of the most basic data vulnerabilities out there.
Don?
Yes, and actually it is the most basic, but unfortunately because it's basic, it is often overlooked. That's why we're going to focus on it today. Basically, this is credentials. It's the same thing as, I'm sorry, can you hear me? Hello? All right, I'm going to continue.
Don, are you there?
I am here. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I'm going to go ahead and move on to the...
I can hear you.
Okay, and I believe the panel can also hear me, the people listening, so I will go ahead and continue. Unless Melissa cuts me off, I'll keep talking. I'm a lawyer, so I like to hear my own voice. Credentials are often overlooked because they are the most basic of security whenever you're trying to protect your data. Now, where you fall into problems, and of course I've got credentials up on the screen right now. Credentials, as you know, are the same thing as a backstage pass at a concert to see your favorite artist, Justin Bieber, whatever the case may be. If it were simple, anybody could go to Kinko's and get a copy and beat it backstage with their favorite artist. That is exactly the same situation you have with any system that you have which connects to the internet or even the intranet within your system, within your company. If you're a larger company, the more people that have access to protected files, the more liability you're going to have and the more problems. So default credentials are going to be of two things. They're going to be your user ID, which identifies you as who you are, and then your password, which really these days should probably be called a pass phrase because that's a lot more secure way to do it. But what I'd like to focus on today, and if I can go to the next slide, is why this is so important. People don't realize it's important because it is so simple. If you go to Google and you go ahead and search default password list, I got over 152 million hits. Now, say only 1% of that is actually relevant, which would be actual default password list. You can go on the internet and go and get lists of what the default passwords for pretty much any vendor system which is sold off the shelf, whether it be a router system, whether it be a software program, anything that is on the market for sale. Those manufacturers do, which is efficient for them to make money, which is they start with a default password. Generally, it's going to be something strange, something that looks like it would be very secure because it's going to be a series of letters and numbers which make no sense whatsoever, so you may think that's very secured, but actually it's the most unsecured method because it is on a list somewhere that third parties can access, whether it be the vendor themselves, the manufacturer, or in the case of Googling, default password list has been put on the internet. And the reason for that is, say you have set up a new router system, you have forgotten the password, thank goodness you've never changed the default, you can go on the internet and find it, get back in there, change your setting, and wonderful, you're back in. The problem is if your neighbor can have access to your Wi-Fi on that router system, they can go on Google, look up the default password list for Linksys, and get into your files in your computer through that link. Next page, please. Now with this list that is actually out on the internet, these lists that are out there, this is widely known through many different hackers. This is something that is very exploited also. Now, the previous speaker was talking about how you need to know what kind of attackers may come after your specific business. Well, understand, there are attackers out there that do this for profit and will attack anything they possibly can, and the default credentials and passwords are exactly what they're looking for because they don't know what they're looking for. They're looking to gain access, and then once they do, they can sell that access on the black market. So if they're able to get in through the most simple method, of which is just your default credentials, they can sell it on the black market, and find who is interested in your information. What I have on the screen there are some examples, and this is actually some of the main problems with default credentials. On the Voyager Alpha Force, that was a system, a SQL Server system, which had no password. The default was no password. So what did a smart hacker do? He created a program which would scour the internet looking for programs which the default password was blank. And of course, they were located in the Philippines and they were successful. Zotab, another situation you have is you don't realize that certain parts of your system have access or share access with other parts of the system, so you need to focus on those also, like file and print sharing. If you have those activated and you also have a weak or non-existent default password, well then they're going to have access to all of that also. And one place to look for is guest username and password systems. You may go in and set yourself up as Don Galvez and have your wonderful password, but then you have a guest system which is allowed in, and that one is blank. That is very common, and that is a backdoor into that type of security breach. My spooler, this is a situation where the system was set up, but no password was set at all. And what I mean by that is many of you may buy off-the-shelf items for home or your business, and sometimes you do the setup wizard. Love the setup wizard, makes life so easy. You click yes, 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 and then it starts running. Problem is that sometimes one of those yeses that's not included in there is, would you like to set up a password? So you are never asked or prompted to set up a password, so you completely pass it. And what happens, you've completely set up a system which has no password whatsoever. So again, you can fall into the Voyager Alpha Force program, which can access over the internet. Next slide, please. Let's see, next are just some funny ones which you can find in the internet, like some 14-year-olds found an old book that had default passwords to an ATM. They actually accessed it and were nice enough to actually tell the bank before they got in any trouble. The next one, I'm sure some of y'all saw on the internet that the U.S. Emergency Alert System was hacked by someone using a default password because they knew what systems that the Emergency Alert System worked on. And so what they did is, just like I just told you before, they got on the internet, they Googled default passwords for X system, they tried each one until they got in, and then they used it for a little bit of fun and warned everyone of a zombie apocalypse. Now, I understand those are funny examples, but there's been recently one that I haven't been able to put on a slide here, which is very important, that has to do with the Starbucks password or Starbucks cards. There are people that actually set up their Starbucks card to deduct money from their bank account. Now, you may think, well, my Starbucks card, if they steal it, they're going to be stealing $10 from my card. Big deal. I don't need a big pass or a hard password for my system on the internet. The problem is it's linked to your bank account to deduct $20 a month. Through that back door, Starbucks got in a lot of trouble because people were able to go through the easy Starbucks system and then get to actual bank accounts to take money from the system. So the reason why this is so important is because it can have very large repercussions. Next slide, please. This is another attempt at being funny. This is my segue into shared credentials because the more people that know your password, the more problems there are. Next slide, please. And the reason I bring this up is because in the context of a business, this happens a lot. You're going to have several people that have access to something secure, say legal documents that are on the server system, say construction documents, intellectual property documents. Now, the more people that have access to those files, of course, the more liability you're going to have is that they can actually get out there. Now, one thing we need to do is a little bit of definition, which is the next slide, please. Usually all you have is a ID and password, but what you need to understand is the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication is the ID and password. Talked about earlier, it's very important to make sure that whenever you get anything third party, you get rid of that default password, but also there's authorization. Anybody that has credentials which are shared has the same authorization that you do. So if you share your credentials with your neighbor and you have access to legal files on your system, they have access to legal files on your system. this is something that needs to be checked regularly. Anytime a new employee comes on into the system, you need to make sure that they get their own unique authentication and their own unique authorization to each of the systems, and only limit their authorization to those systems in which they need, and revisit that issue on every single current employee on a very regular basis. The higher the level of authorization, the less you want to share credentials. So again, this is just the most simplest form of security. Next slide, please. This is the simplest form of security, which is just your password. Again, it's something you want to revisit on a very regular basis. Some of the repercussions, as you can see here, Verizon did a 2011 security breach survey, which found that several employees, as they left the company, shared credentials. Now, what they did is they had access to certain documents. They either sold their information on the black market. They, after leaving the company, they accessed it off-site and got information and sold it on the black market. One thing as an employer you need to consider is if you are about to terminate somebody, you need to go ahead and deauthorize any authorization to sensitive information. If you don't know someone is leaving and they surprise you and say, well, I'm leaving for a better job, make sure you immediately, upon learning of that, end all authorization and credentials, and also check the history of access that they have had through the period that you think that they were on their way out. Make sure they weren't accessing sensitive data, make sure they weren't copying it or expatriating it from the sensitive server. So again, these are very, very simple portions. The guys are going to talk about more important or more complex issues, but if you don't lock the front door, then what's the point of having all these other security systems? And I will pass it along to our next speaker.